Thank you all for grabbing the reins. My name's Eric Wahlberg, and we're joined today by Will Long. Will, thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. Um,
Absolutely.
so, yeah, Will, you run the Nashville branch of the Neoliberal Project. You're an AFF fellow, and you also write a Substack called Holding the Center.
That's
Why don't
right.
we start by having you, unpack some of that and introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Starting out with the first thing, I do some work with the Neoliberal Project, which is I guess, an organization that kind of started out on Reddit a couple years ago, off of the Bad Economics subreddit. And I wasn't necessarily kind of a part of that group then, but I kind of found my way towards that community through some friends, and then kind of got involved with the actual project itself offline as the chapter head for the Nashville branch, which I started just before coronavirus hit. So unfortunately, I haven't gotten a chance to kind of really build out off of a digital presence into kind of offline,
Right.
which sucks, but that's how it is. But yeah, the Neoliberal Project is kind of focused on more centrist, pragmatic solutions towards kind of political problems in the U.S. It's more focused on kind of economics and that kind of thing. But the core idea of the Neoliberal Project is kind of approaching politics, et cetera, from a local, pragmatic perspective, kind of building it towards the community that we're a part of. Here in Nashville, obviously, we're kind of in a Republican area. So kind of my upbringing is more conservative, but, you know, I guess younger generations are obviously more liberal. So I kind of try and bridge the gap between all of that and kind of approach things from a radically centrist standpoint, which kind of sounds like a meme, but I think there is
No.
something to it. And I think a lot of people are kind of in this area looking for solutions that can actually be done and implemented.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Great.
And let's see, my Substack. Yes, I started that a couple months ago. Everybody was starting a Substack. Substack kind of seemed like the platform that I thought would be pretty good for what I wanted to do with it, kind of blog at will about things that are kind of on my mind or kind of subjects that friends and family are talking about. For example, I wrote an article recently about term limits and kind of how to approach that and kind of beat back the idea that term limits are good. I don't really see term limits as being a good thing. So I kind of try to make the argument that the ballot box is the ultimate term limit. And that's just kind of an example of the kind of thing I post there, along with articles I kind of find interesting. It's pretty similar to Ahmed's Post Apathy newsletter, where he kind of posts different articles that he finds really interesting. AFF, America's Future Foundation, is a program kind of geared towards more libertarian people, but it's kind of open towards people who kind of lean that way anyways. You don't have to be a libertarian, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But it's geared towards writing fellows and people who are kind of getting into writing and stuff like that. So I love the written word, obviously. So I figured it would be great, and I got recommended to it by a couple friends. So I figured, why not?
Awesome. Great. Well, you led me to my first question with the written word, which is, let's start with something fun. So, what is your definition of neoliberalism? I know a lot of people joke around about this on Twitter and many other places.
Yeah, that's kind of a running joke. I would have to say neoliberalism is sort of kind of a meaningless term these days. But I think what the Neoliberal Project kind of aims to do is take that term, look at it from, okay, who was using it originally? You have Hayek and Friedman and those of their ilk, I guess, and kind of figure out, well, what is it that they actually stood for? Were their ideas originally? Why were they a part of this group together? What did they stand for? That kind of thing. And it's not necessarily predicated on these people or these figures and kind of ideas they had. The project kind of aims to uh, build more of a big tent, kind of under the banner of neoliberalism, which is the understanding that the current economic order, which was kind of started after World War II, took different neoliberal ideas and applied them to create a liberal world order that lifted people out of poverty globally, kind of created international institutions for different countries to be a part of, kind of for the goal of improving the quality of life for everybody, et cetera. In the United States, I would have to say a lot of politicians in the last 40 years are probably mostly neoliberal. A lot of them kind of don't realize they're neoliberal, or they think, or I guess they apply the term liberal liberally to kind of make a pun on that. And it refers to left liberalism, obviously. But from an academic perspective, I think neoliberal is pretty accurate, kind of describing our current order of things. You know, you can look at the Fukuyama definition of where the world is at now. Communism fell in 91, and now kind of the world order is pretty neoliberal. Again, it's a very broad term, but it's pretty much a very liberal understanding of world affairs, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, you talk about Hayek and Friedman, so you have like the Austrian and Chicago schools of economics, but it seems like it wasn't institutionalized. It was like institutionalized with Keynesianism, like Maynard Keynes. From an economics perspective, it seems like that's the regime we're in, right? I mean, you've got a whole bunch of crypto people who obviously love Hayek, and then you have maybe some other people that enjoy Friedman. But right now, at least in terms of like, and certainly we saw with, you know, the COVID response of stimulus and so on, that we very much live in like a Keynesian era. And then what I also find interesting is that you kind of, it was like a Wilsonian geopolitical view of like the international world order, but was only actually realized like through World War II, and then kind of the, you know, instantiation of the world order basically through might of the United States after that. What I find interesting about this is that, like, so we had the neoliberalism really got institutionalized in the last crisis, if you will.
Right.
And I would certainly, you know, like I don't know if you can see it, but the book on my table behind me is Will Strauss and Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, which is a generational theory of, of history. And it's called The Fourth Turning because every, you know, basically and I talked about this with Ahmed, who of course then really humbled me by pointing me in the direction of a 14th century Arabic scholar who basically this predates, and they're basically pulling from, at least to a certain extent. So the last fourth turning would be World War II. Then you have kind of this cycle kind of coming to an end here. And basically the fourth turning from Neil Howe, Will Strauss is no longer with us. From his perspective, the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008 was kind of the beginning of the fourth turning. Fourth turnings last, generally speaking, something like 20 years on average. So I guess it seems like if you look at it through that lens, Will, like neoliberalism and would have to basically go through some kind of transformation almost to adapt to this new regime or new world. And I certainly want the part of this conversation to at least involve that. Like, how do you see through this? How do you see neoliberalism evolving basically as a result of COVID or the great financial crisis? Any thoughts on anything I've just said?
So I think you're basically right. Kind of about neoliberalism itself, kind of, I guess, coming into itself after the last financial crisis. Obviously, my background isn't economic or anything like that, but I think the way that you're kind of looking at it is pretty accurate. I think Obama was definitely kind of the quintessential definition of the way I kind of see neoliberalism, but also I think Obama definitely had some failings as president. Martin Gurry talks about it in Revolt of the Public. He kind of talks about how Obama really wasn't that great, sort of. trying to think here how he kind of puts it. He brings up a lot of stuff where he kind of played into it's kind of a roundabout way of answering the question, but he kind of plays into this old order with some new ideas, I guess. You mentioned Keynes. I think that definitely is probably the best way to describe the current understanding of the economic system right now and kind of how we've approached it throughout history in recent times.
Let's start like with this, which is like, it's a radical period of change right now, right? Whether it's coronavirus, some people look at technological stagnation kind of ending through like mRNA vaccines and deep minds, protein folding algorithm and all these things, right? And so you write a Substack called the Center Should Hold, and neoliberalism, which is really, many people view neoliberalism as the old order, and so I feel like it's incumbent upon the neoliberal project and yourself to kind of make a case in many ways for either how that's how that's actually the framework with which we can ride this period out, or you could say like neoliberalism will change, and maybe here are some ways in which I see it changing.
I think, okay, so I do have an answer. It's a little bit complicated and a little bit roundabout, definitely. So the way I kind of see it is neoliberalism could probably be understood as the old order or some form of it. Matt Palmer has a kind of way of describing this. He wrote an article that he posted on his GitHub. He calls it a reformist ideology, sort of, on liberalism, where we're currently kind of at a traditional understanding of the liberal world order. That's kind of where we're at. But politicians in the past that would probably be understood as neoliberal aren't necessarily neoliberal in a pure sense, where they took neoliberal ideas, applied them to kind of their approach to different issues. And they could be called neoliberal in a way. But the way I kind of see it is real neoliberalism has never been tried, sort of, kind of like the joke where real communism has never been tried. But I guess the way I see it is neoliberalism in its proper understanding is reformist, a reformist understanding of liberalism and kind of old institutions. And it kind of brings in the idea that institutions themselves are good, that inclusive institutions are necessary to create a solid framework for society to operate in, to uphold a government that is truly liberal, and kind of fix areas that haven't really worked out in the end. There's plenty of areas in American society that really haven't worked out. You saw riots and stuff this past summer on police reform, defund the police and stuff like that. Obviously, nobody wants to defund the police in the real America, I guess, per se. But the understanding that police as an institution that as an arm of the state to kind of, I guess, keep society in order, obviously that's necessary, but we can say that we need to reform our understanding of that institution. And that's just one example of kind of approaching something from a neoliberal standpoint, that things do need to change. There's a lot of problems with society, obviously from a broad perspective. Ahmed talks about that in the Building an Alliance Sacre article. I think a lot of the issues that he has with kind of the current age are pretty spot on, accurate. I would definitely agree with them to a large extent. And to me, that's kind of the neoliberal approach, is that, people talk about building a post-liberal synthesis. Like, that's kind of the thing that blogs like Palladium are built off of. I think that kind of understanding of what comes next kind of goes hand in hand with what the neoliberal project, I think, is trying to do. Where
so is it are people dressing what at its core is neoliberal by philosophy up as other things? I mean, is it I've read a lot that like social justice is out and like
Right.
contrarianism is in, right? And it's like everything's about that that kind of point of view. And so I wonder, because what I'm getting from you, Will, is it's like institutions are good as a framework.
Right.
That institutions
Right.
are good, but institutions need to evolve over time to address the evolving needs
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
society. And if you take like Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, I just learned this through an article. I can't remember where it was from, but he was the only PhD. He was only present to have a PhD in political science. And he, just because of the times, and I'm pretty sure he had some pretty eugenics points of views on things. Certainly, was I think in vogue at the time. But
Right.
really thought that people were looking at the government and governance as a machine, but the government isn't really a machine. It's made up of people, and it's who are organic, and so like by definition, the government should be organic and like evolve over time. And so I did cut you off, and I do apologize if you want to pick it up from where you left off. But what uh, you know, I don't know if Ahmed would define himself as a neoliberal, nor would I be so sure that some of the people in Palladium's arena would consider themselves that. What do you
Right.
think about that?
I don't know if they would call themselves that, but I think that a lot of people that take an issue with or call problems today kind of the product of a neoliberal understanding of government, the state, society, etc. I think that people are onto something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that people are wrong when they say that some of this is because of neoliberalism. I think the term neoliberalism itself has kind of become too much of a pejorative uh,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that I think that the historical understanding, uh, when you look at what some of these kind of original people were talking about in different aspects, um, have kind of gotten distorted over time. But I think that liberalism itself is pretty overdue for a solid critique. And to me, I think that's what the aim of neoliberal, or I guess the modern understanding of neoliberalism should be doing, is itself a critique of liberalism, but it uses the liberal framework to kind of build something new for the good of society, I guess, for lack of a better term, I
Sure,
suppose.
sure. I like that. Okay, so we naturally have to talk about the incoming U.S. administration. A lot of people kind of view it as a rejection of populism, and by default, a return to a neoliberal worldview. But
Right.
there are two things that I find interesting. One, recently Biden saying that he will be keeping the Peter Navarro's tariffs on China in place at least until they do some kind of an evaluation of the relationship with China. And the second thing is that I think he also came out with this policy that basically any government contract would need to be procured through American vendors. And I
Right.
wonder, that's interesting. It's almost like a little bit of either populism, or if you want to say Trumpism, um, is sticking with that neoliberal, or it's kind of changed the neoliberal taste of neoliberalism here in the United States
Right.
just as a result. And maybe that would basically be right in line with your definition of as an institutions evolve over time and reform themselves over time. What do you think, at a high level, of Biden's administration being considered neoliberal in nature, and what do you think about that potential for the new administration to kind of carry forward what many people were calling populism, but really, almost to your definition, maybe absorbing some of that, integrating some of that, so that the institutions could continue to improve and optimize for the given moment?
I think in terms of the tariffs themselves, I've kind of come to challenge my preconceptions on that a little bit
Mm-hmm.
over time, especially over this last year. You know, I think to an extent, and this is probably a hot take among kind of some in the community, is that the tariffs are probably good, but
Mm-hmm.
only if, and this is kind of where I think the neoliberalism or the neoliberal approach to it comes. Uh, only if we offset the effects of the tariffs through multilateral trade deals like TPP and stuff like that.
Right.
So we can keep some of the tariffs in place, kind of as a way of punishing China. Obviously, sanctions are definitely the way to go because of the genocide happening over there. But we should definitely seek some of our shortcomings in trade because of these tariffs through multilateral trade deals. I think TPP is definitely a way to go. I really hope the Biden administration rejoins that. I think that was a big success of the Obama administration in joining it.
Sure.
I think that's going to end up being the biggest mistake of the Trump presidency is pulling out of that. That's kind of where I stand on the tariffs. I think kind of approaching things dogmatically from an ideological perspective probably isn't the best idea, especially with the way world affairs are at the moment, because we're in a really unique situation where suddenly we have all of these powers kind of on equal footing in a way. And I think a new approach is definitely needed. I think the Biden administration has indicated somewhat that they're willing to work through international bodies again, these institutions and stuff. I actually think personally that some of these institutions are in desperate need of reform. For example, the United Nations. At this point, honestly, my trust in the United Nations is pretty rock bottom at this point. They've kind of moved away from what they were originally supposed to be and have let too many autocrats join in and have a large say in kind of what they do. Russia and China, obviously, that kind of thing.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you just look at who currently leads the Human Rights Council, it's a joke. I mean, it's like, I don't know who it is right now, but I mean, take your pick of banana republics and authoritarian dictators, and they basically have say there. And I think a lot of people were having fun with the critique of by China and others of, I think from Iran as well, of the United States using a lot of like woke ideology to criticize the very, very interesting, and like that they would choose that, but just how laughable that is coming from, Iran, which is an enormously repressive regime, and China, which is undoubtedly, participating in probably the most technologically advanced genocide ever. Cool. And okay, so multipolarity, which is something you just alluded to. What I see as Biden's kind of adaptation of neoliberalism to a different world, right? Because I think one of the failings of Obama was that probably not in the beginning of his administration, but certainly in the second, half, the world really had fundamentally moved into a much more multipolar place, and regional blocks and so on and so forth. And so people who think that Biden is like, if Biden does rehash the Obama administration, I mean, we're screwed. I mean, that is would be such a terrible matching of policies to the actual world. So one thing that I've seen that I found encouraging, I'd be curious to hear what you think, is what seems to be a push for basically some institution akin to something like a G20, where it's like focused on just the like major economic democracies. So not only including people like, the European Union, Canada, Japan, South Korea also being included, Taiwan probably maybe as an observer, but actually bringing also Asia into the fold. And one thing that I've talked to Ahmed about, and something I'm very, very keen on, is the expansion of NATO to include the Quad, which is includes India, Australia, New Zealand can come along, and Japan and South Korea. So what do you think about that as an evolution, both of international alliances, but also just in general of responding to the reality of multipolarity, also kind of addressing some internal domestic grievances, certainly held by people, who voted for Trump, this year, with respect to burden sharing, which, I mean, we could certainly argue. I don't know if you could say the same thing about Asian allies, but Germany is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, and I think spends like 1.2% of GDP on defense.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about all that?
I think we definitely should expand NATO. I think that's probably a good step forward. Forming a bigger military alliance with other countries kind of aligned with our interests is probably a good thing. Um, yeah, I think any sort of economic alliance is definitely a good thing. Anything that kind of allows us to, I guess, I did say ideological dogmatism was bad, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of the idea of free trade being good, that kind of thing. I think in general that is definitely a good thing. But I think we're probably going to see economics being used more as a weapon these days,
Sure.
especially with China kind of on the rise, and suddenly they've become our rival, basically on equal footing almost. Um, yeah, anybody we can bring into uh, or under our wing, sort of, to kind of create an alliance in any way is a good idea.
Can this is my one piece of thing that I find is a contrarian take of mine, but I really still struggle to understand why, which is the view on Russia. The reason being is that I find people's view of Russia to be like funny because the best thing you can say about Putin is that he's played a really weak and ever weakening hand really well, right? So, Russia is a country in terminal decline. I mean, from a
Right.
demographic perspective, its economy is based on the export of oil, and it doesn't control the price of oil. I mean, could you imagine, the vulnerability you have, these OPEC plus meetings that clearly go like awry because they like have a temper tantrum because they don't control the price of their key export. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and just the media, and certainly nobody, I think, on either side of the aisle would let Trump do this, but Trump wanted to reinvite Russia into to these various geopolitical meetings. What do you think about what am I getting wrong here? Why not just let them at least whatever like the domestic win that he needs to telegraph to his population, Putin, let him do that. But like, why not
Right.
take that existential risk of the fact that they contain basically the other 50% of nuclear warheads, and just kind of be like realistic about what threat they actually pose at this point to the United States outside of their nuclear program?
I don't necessarily have a full kind of a well informed view on the specifics of this, but uh, I think the way that we look at Russia, we kind of, there's a lot of America that still looks at Russia as kind of our main rival when we really
Yeah,
shouldn't be.
yeah.
And they're really more of a short term, I guess, rival at this point. Right now, the clear other pole is China, obviously. But I think, yeah, like you said, the oil thing, Russia, I mean, that's really Russia's last hand for sure. They're not, they don't really have very good prospects. They just kind of want to take back old territory at this point, or kind of build an umbrella of power in countries. And that's clearly not a very strong way forward, even though that's what they're looking at with Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries kind of in the former, or that were part of the former USSR. Yeah, I just, in general, I don't see Russia as a very powerful enemy anymore. They're definitely not the long term bad guy that a lot of people still think they are.
What do you actually think about the fact, like the idea of basically coming, like bringing them into the fold? I mean, I'm not sure they're interested in that. I don't know if there's enough trust, or and it also, one could argue like Russia is very much a country, as is the United States, in my opinion, that like needs an enemy, in order to kind of organize, large, national projects in certain areas.
Right.
But what I find interesting is for example, China's Belt One Road going through the Caucasus and all the stands and all of that. And the fact that China and Russia basically share a massive land border in the north, it really seems like one could engage with Russia and maybe turn their guys and their malice towards China in something that would be a lot more positive, for example, from the United States. I mean, that's just how I view it. I mean, give them foreign direct investment, capital flows, and so on and so forth, especially if it would mean like taking a lot of the nuclear risk off the table. Because at the end of the day, no one's going to win in an environment where, I mean, people like talk about bringing China into the nuclear arms agreements. It's like China totally, but like China has like 60 warheads. I don't even know what the number is, but like the United States and Russia have like 5,000 each. It's a totally qualitatively different thing. So, I mean, perhaps you could, and it's super okay for you to be like, listen, it's just like not politically a viable or digestible thing. I mean, no president, Biden, Trump, go farther left or farther right, or so no one's going to be able to get that past just the political consciousness of the country.
Right. I guess from a practical standpoint, I think there's too much of a distaste for that. You tell any regular person, hey, maybe we should get into some sort of alliance with Russia. The Democrats in the last 4 years have kind of continually beat their base into seeing Russia as kind of like a great bad guy, even though, people who've really been paying attention know that Russia's pretty weak at this point. I would say still they're probably somewhat of a threat, but they're just so weak. They don't really have many options. I guess the rest of Europe, Western Europe, obviously doesn't really see Russia in a very good light.
Germany does.
That's true. Yeah. I just don't think America would really be into any sort of alliance with Russia at this point. It would probably take a while and a lot of political capital to kind of shift opinion towards anything like that. But yeah.
Have you read Peter Zeihan?
His Disunited Nations book has been on my wish list for a while. I haven't picked it up yet, but that's definitely one that I would like to read. As for the rest of his stuff, I've read a few things on his blog. If I remember correctly, he put out a newsletter recently where he kind of talked about the current situation. But other than that, that's about it.
Sure. So he's got 3 books that goes all the way from like, I think the first book is Accidental Superpower, talking about how basically the United States had very little, there was very little forethought into the idea that the United States would be like a superpower, and then what does it do? Also because America was founded on a very anti-imperialistic, kind of footing that it would more or less shy away from that role, all the way through to, the United States being a superpower and how it uses its superpower position as the world superpower to kind of create basically a bribe. He considers, so what I find very interesting about him is he looks at the world order, and he doesn't really look at it in these kinds of very optimistic. From coming from your perspective, looking at it as a neoliberal project, as if it's this kind of joint effort by countries from around the world, obviously led by the United States, to kind of build towards some common good, whether it's Francis Fukuyama's, end of history and so on. He thinks of it as a bribe. So, he looks at things like Bretton Woods and says the United States was the only country whose industrial base survived the world wars, right? So what did it allow? What it allowed, with Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan and so on, and free trade, was we will be the world's reserve currency through Bretton Woods. We will, basically become the military protector and guarantor of security for the continent of Europe and Japan and so on. And what will allow you to do is basically reindustrialize your countries and, export your way back to modernity. And all you need to do is side with us against the Russians. And so then he says in 91, when the USSR falls, there's no need for the bribe anymore. And
Right.
Disunited Nations is basically a book where he says, so now the United States, since 1991, it's been a massive, the world's only superpower adrift in the world. Like, and why is it like, why is it spending so much GDP per capita on, defense and so on? So, why are we not investing that domestically in the United States? It's kind of almost a populist take on certain things.
Right.
So what do you think about that? I mean, it's a much more cynical view of the last 75 years, right? Since the end of the Second World War. And basically the way that it's kind of a testable hypothesis. If Biden does not re-engage the rest of the world, although I think he makes it very clear that he intends to.
Right.
What do you think about the prospects of the United States being like, listen, I have two oceans between me and the rest of the world. I export like 14. My imports and exports represents like something like 14% of GDP, half of which is just in between Canada and Mexico. So it's like, why do we care, Will?
So you mentioned spending so much on defense and less on domestic issues. I think the way that I see kind of the post World War II world order is Russia at the time obviously was the USSR. I think they were. I would have to say they were very dangerous.
Sure.
I don't necessarily think that kind of approaching it from a realist standpoint where we just kind of let them do their thing and we do our thing, develop our side of the world, would have been an advisable thing. That's an interesting question. That's a tough one to answer because a lot of it is kind of hypothetical in the sense that I feel like we've kind of gotten to the point in world affairs where everyone kind of is fend for yourself now, where we've kind of, it sort of harkens back to the realist view of international relations where we kind of have gotten to that point because there's no Russia for us to fight anymore. So now we have several great powers sort of vying for hegemony, like China and like us, who've basically kind of walked away from being that world power because of a lot of the policies of Donald Trump. And I think a lot of people kind of underrate the appetite in America for that kind of thing, where we kind of focus on, I guess from the populist view, where we kind of focus on, fully funding healthcare or cutting taxes and spending on as few things as possible. And I think those are sort of the same thing in a way from an approach standpoint. I don't know if that's a good thing. And I think that the current situation has kind of proved that that's probably not a very good thing right now. Because we kind of do need to shift things back towards how they were pre-Trump, where we're kind of participating in institutions as much as possible. But the weakness of that kind of approach is, well, now we have these hostile powers like China who are trying to circumvent these and work around them, in places like Africa, or creating parallel institutions. And I think that's probably going to be our best way forward, is by creating our own parallel institutions that kind of work towards this view of liberal democracy. But again, that's kind of presupposing that liberal democracy is where we want to be, when we know that there are failings of liberal democracy that should be addressed now and moving forward, kind of in world affairs, domestic affairs, etc.
I would grant you that the larger number of countries that would adhere to liberal democracy would also take that step function in the same direction, were there to be some kind of evolution. Um, yeah, no, and just for from my perspective, I actually think one of the most exciting things about the prospect of China's rise, which I, by the way, think is not largely, but to an extent overstated. Um,
Right.
just from an economics perspective, I mean, if anyone believes any of the numbers that comes out of uh, China from
Right.
an economics perspective is kind of laughable. I don't know if it was either Harvard or University of Chicago. They took data from flyover data from satellites and used that data just from the energy output of their economy to make an estimation on the size of their economy. And they've probably been overstating it. I think something like 3 to 4% per annum for a long period of time, like since like 2000 some odd or whatever. I mean, it gives them an economy that is the second largest in the world, something like probably $10 trillion, still almost half that of the United States.
Right.
But that China actually serves as a really great narrative mechanism, both domestically for the United States, because as I mentioned to you, I'm very much of the belief that the United States is a population that like needs something to do. Like we can't
Right.
it's
Yeah,
such
absolutely.
a large country. It's so pent up like with energy that if it doesn't have and the frontier is expense. I mean, we need more frontiers. We need challenges, and we need Goliaths to our David,
Right.
or And so I actually think that China is a very useful thing for the American psyche, as well as maybe to be something for the international community to galvanize around.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that there's different approaches to kind of using that to their advantage, or I guess using it to our advantage. Right now, you have Democrats and Republicans kind of fighting over different visions for the United States moving forward as a rival power to China. People like Josh Hawley kind of want to push heavy industrial policy, fairly social conservative, or policy that lends itself to social conservative views, that kind of thing. And then you have Democrats who kind of want to take the Trump approach of, well, let's try and shift the economy back towards the United States, build that up, and then kind of put in place universal programs. Like some of the Democrats want to do universal health care, that kind of thing. I don't really know what it would look like in 10 years or what it will look like in 10 years. But I think that we're starting to see kind of the development of new visions moving forward of what the United States can be in and of itself against China. And I think that the idea that America needs kind of something pushing it forward is pretty spot on from a societal standpoint and from a political standpoint. And I think that like when it comes to politics at a base level, I'm always partial to people who want to work within the system pragmatically and look for slightly more incremental approaches, but with somewhat radical results. And I think that moving forward, what America should do is come up with programs that kind of, reaffirm the American dream to the American people in some form or fashion, and kind of draw everyone in, some sort of national unity project of some sort, or some sort of narrative that people can kind of jump around. You mentioned like driving factors in American society. I mentioned earlier, I was talking about Fukuyama earlier. Recently, there was that ARIA article on Unheard about how Fukuyama was always right. I think that's a really great article. Can
you talk a little bit just for those, Will, just for those who didn't read it, if you could just give at least just give the overview.
So basically, the author kind of takes a careful reading of the second part of The Last Man of Fukuyama's book and kind of talks about the Nietzschean idea of sort of people with a purpose, a driving purpose. Once liberalism kind of takes over and it's basically won since 1991. We've kind of entered a phase of everybody sitting at home eating potato chips, watching Netflix, the Netflix and chill vision of America, where we're not really working towards anything. And we're just kind of sitting at home, going to work 40 hours a week, that kind of thing. There's not really anything left to do. And people get bored, so they need something to do. And they kind of, online communities have sort of supplanted religion, purpose, sort of. Everything is kind of going everywhere at once, sort of.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Fukuyama was getting at, is that he wasn't necessarily saying, this is it. This is how it's going to be for infinity years. Liberalism is one, which to an extent it did, but he kind of gives us a vision of, well, this is how it could very well end. And this is probably what's going to happen. And, that kind of fits in with the whole idea of, well, what's our purpose as a country now? We have China to kind of combat sort of in different ways, but from a personal, individual, societal level, what is there to kind of fight for? We kind of need something like that now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was going to ask you, which I find to be either the limitations or the negative drawbacks of what people ascribe to neoliberalism, which is like the increased atomization of the society, right? Or
Right.
the replacement of communities for the free market, or the conversion of the view of people from citizens to consumers, right?
Right.
All of these different things that a lot of people would ascribe to kind of the Reagan Thatcher version of neoliberalism that which is very much the regime we live in today. But it's interesting because as I love your definition, by the way, of neoliberalism, because it really does allow for, it's like buttered up. You can't really grab onto it because it's actually always like evolving. And I like that, it's a much more, it's not rigid at all, very evolutionary in its disposition. Like, I couldn't agree with you more that I think that digital tribes and all these things are really something that's evolving out of just a meanings crisis. And then, are you familiar with Ross Douthat? His book, The Decadent Society. So I love that book. And for those of you who don't know, he's actually probably the lone conservative opinion columnist at this point for the New York Times, because Barry Weiss left. So I think he really is the only conservative voice on the opinion page of New York Times. And he writes this incredible book that talks about how American society has become decadent. He points to things like cultural exhaustion, where how many Avenger movies could you possibly have, right? Or the fact that people aren't having children. So, there's not even an incentive. People don't feel like they can, even replenish, the population, that it's worthwhile to replenish the population. And for example, it's like, I mean, Will, you look young, and I think you're married, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I live with my girlfriend. So I'm 26. I know so few people. I don't know how old you are, Will. Maybe you're one of these chameleons that looks like is older than you.
25.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. Okay, yeah. So at least where I'm sitting, I'm talking to you from New York City, which obviously is kind of an example of this atomization on steroids. But from if you look at like the macro, it doesn't really matter if you're in Nashville or New York. If you look at like the generation from a macro perspective, people are not getting married, people are not having children, and so on, which is, I think, the result of a meanings crisis, the atomization of society, and just a general loss of meaning and so on. And so I see two possible options, like forward. One, we've reached peak atheism, which is something that I do believe kind of maybe regardless of anything, that just having a force de majeure like a pandemic, where it was very clear that there were limitations to modernity that we thought like kind of insulated us, where like there are certain things that actually just you cannot you can't protect yourself from, like a pandemic will naturally, as well as the fact that a lot of people were back with their families and so on, that naturally like atheism, which gives you nothing, which is why also I think people on that like in general have a negative reaction to like people like Cuomo banning religious gatherings, and like across the country, like other governors,
Right.
where people were like, listen, I mean, if people are gonna, it's like you can't stand in between somebody and their reprieve from existential angst in the middle of a pandemic. The second option would be for the digital sphere to really become something that like authentically could handle and answer people's existential angst and meaning. That was a huge ramble, Will. Take whatever you want from that, but what do you think about? I mean, I see those two. Ross talks about two, like, different visions that maybe could end decadence. I very much think that the coronavirus actually could be that thing that ended decadence for those variety of reasons, and I
Right.
see either those two options. One that would be a much more a harkening back to something that we've been to before. It will be different, but something a little bit more familiar. But then there could be something that's entirely different, very digital. It could be both.
So there's kind of a few different things that or I guess a few different specific thoughts I have on I guess, meanings crisis per se. One is kind of something that Adam Fitchett talks about. He runs a blog called Cybertrophic. He talks about this specific concept of something called meta-liberalism. I kind of like to think of it as the fulfillment sort of neoliberalism, where it's sort of related to accelerationism in a little bit, where it's sort of like neoliberalism and to an extent kind of left liberalism, kind of at their very peak total logical end, where instead of going towards a more, I guess, a post-liberal world, it's kind of thought of as an opposing model to post-liberalism, where we kind of make it to where society reaches the point where we go past atomization, where everyone has an opportunity to kind of pursue their individual desire to the absolute, as far as you can get, basically, under that concept. I think it's kind of interesting. The way I kind of look at that is I kind of frame that sort of using political exit. And that's kind of how he frames it, is around the idea of political exit. But I kind of like to think of it through a Bruno Macias standpoint, where
I love his book sitting right there. Great.
So basically, you give communities.
We'll pause just
Well,
so
actually,
everyone. I want to give people, because not everyone, though I think a large part of the audience probably knows who he is, and if you're following me, I like retweet him and tweet him all the time.
Right.
He's every time he's retweeted me, it's probably been like a highlight of of the day, right? So Bruno and I, we'll say Macias. I don't know how to do the little accent over his C there, but he was a minister of state for Portugal, and he's a fantastic author. I think he did his PhD at Harvard. And he's got this new book called History Has Begun, in which he espouses an idea called virtualism, which he believes is a very American idea, at least probably in its initial conception, which is this idea that you can kind of, and maybe just take it from there. I just want to make sure that people don't get lost.
So I kind of think that the idea that Adams kind of come up with can be framed from that perspective, where if we are in a meanings crisis, what if we kind of allowed these online communities to be sort of, or I guess act as communities or act as states, sort of, in a way where they were their own kind of meaning creating bodies, or their own communities in and of themselves, where they kind of have the option to explore kind of a new model of society or a new model of the state or something. It kind of sort of harkens back a little bit to Neal Stephenson's Metaverse in Snow Crash, sort of, where they could kind of enter into a virtual reality world, and it was kind of whatever they wanted to build out of it.
Right.
And, you know, you can kind of create meaning within those worlds or within those communities. And I don't necessarily think that liberalism itself has totally destroyed all notion of meaning. To me, I kind of see it as something that gives people the option to have something mean what they want it to be to themselves or to their community or something. And that's kind of the success of sort of online tribes, online communities, that kind of thing. But to an extent, I think in the real world, you know, where real life happens, even though real life, in quotes, has kind of progressively become online life, in the real world, what if we kind of built the future United States, sort of, kind of from that perspective where things became hyper local, et cetera, where people kind of were able to build their own model of a community. And, you know, like big cities, if they were allowed to kind of have more autonomy over how they govern themselves, sort of. It's sort of like federalism on steroids is the way I kind of see it.
Ahmed calls it fractal localism.
Right. Yeah. And I love that term for it. I think that's the perfect term for it. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I look at that. And that's kind of my theory of where we could be headed, where we maybe should be headed. I don't see that as a bad thing. But I also do agree. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll name it for you, Will. I said I'll name it for you. It's Russian doll liberalism, because it's not meta. It seems like it's because you could go out from something very small all the way out, and it's more about like opt in, and you can opt in both, you know, through your IP address or through your location and so on. So I it's interesting.
Right, exactly. I think that's the perfect definition for it, or the term for it. You know, the idea that Bruno kind of comes up with, where exit is the utmost right of liberalism, I think that is pretty fundamental. Is we have the ability to kind of exit a situation politically we don't like. Well, you know, I don't really see the idea that we should be able to do that sort of to an extreme as bad. You know, having these communities that kind of create their own thing sort of is a good thing. And I think that that's kind of the true success of liberalism moving forward, is that it's given us the opportunity to create new communities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I've been thinking about of why I think the meanings crisis happened or is happening, though I think it might be ending. And the reason is because, so back to Ross Douthat, who wrote The Decadent Society, one of his arguments for why he thinks that decadence could continue for like a much longer time is video games, and how video games has kind of been able to cannibalize a lot of the worst parts of human nature, whether it's through violence or so on. And if you look at youth crime levels since basically the advent of video games, they've decreased a tremendous amount, even during coronavirus, even with what we considered like heavy rioting in the summer. If you look at like death from rioting and all these things, still at like very low levels relative to, let's say, 1968 or something of that. And what I think happened with the meanings crisis is you had the secularization of liberalism and modern societies. And then you also had a certain level of atomization where a lot of people were going online. But the problem was that the fidelity and how convincing, you know, the fact that that your experience of the digital world is two-dimensional as opposed to three-dimensional, or even four-dimensional, the way you experience the universe. And that as those interfaces improve over time, your like evolution from your brain's perspective, it's hard to take meaning from a two-dimensional interface. Like you were evolved to find meaning in 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions.
Right.
And so perhaps like one of the reasons why we've experienced a meanings crisis is the fact that basically we are existing in that uncomfortable period of time where where we don't have the digital interfaces that allow us that exit and also that like free communication and movement from digital tribes, that are much more similar to the way we kind of experience the world and meaning in the analog world.
Yeah, I think I mean, that basically kind of goes hand in hand with the whole Messiasian, I guess, idea of virtualism, where, people kind of have the freedom to, I guess, enter into a fantasy or kind of find a fantasy that's sort of similar to, well, I mean, obviously, I don't know if anybody now would want to go back to, 1164 or whatever and experience that world with the modern conveniences we have. But it's sort of, right. I guess, the base desire is kind of expressed through that sort of where, kids now these days, they have the ability to kind of do that. So, they're bored, and that's kind of where this innate desire to kind of look for something more through unrest, like the riots in the summer where people are they're sitting at home. They're not doing anything. They're receiving stimulus checks.
Yeah.
Video games kind of satiated them, and, the Netflix and chill generation, essentially. Right. I think a lot of that kind of goes in parallel with each other and kind of interlaps in really interesting ways. But yeah, no, I think that the greater availability of fantastical escape is probably definitely a big contributor to, I guess, youthful boredom in a way.
Mm-hmm. But do you think, though, that as the interfaces with that fantastical universe improve, could that help us better ascribe and like find meaning in those new worlds?
I think so. I actually do think so. And while I think to an extent some of that could definitely be bad, sort of, I think ultimately the ability for people to find new communities around things that people probably wouldn't be able to think of 30 years ago is probably sort of the beginnings of a new, I guess, society, sort of, in a way, for lack of a better term. The ability to kind of build these new societies around different meanings and subjects and things, etc.
Yeah, two things, just to kind of, I would interject to make sure that people don't feel like we're just going super maximal on this, because I do think there are dangers, right? And like there needs to be counterbalances. Right. One thing was something that Ahmed talked about, which is basically like a technological Sabbath. And like, we don't really have rituals, like, cause like technology is kind of too new, like consumer technology is too new, where like we've instantiated in our culture that like on the weekend or some period of time or take your pick, you do not interact with technology. And so like, it allows you the exit from like the freedom to exit the digital world. Right. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I have my email on all the time, and it could be the weekend. My day job, my company is in Singapore. I can get emails all hours of the day. I don't have the freedom to exit my job, in
exactly.
many ways. So certain cultural, like ritualistic things that could provide that, I think would be a great counterbalance. And the second thing is, I was talking to this guy, Josh Marin, and also I think Ahmed we talked about it, because Ahmed very much prefers the Urbit kind of view of things. Urbit's this company, for those who don't know, where they're basically trying to create like the internet from the ground up all over again, but with very simple user interfaces, so that like they're not trying to play off your like evolutionary psychology to get you to do more and more and more. Just provide you the things that you need to know, security, be able to build communities with groups of people and so on. So like Ahmed doesn't even think that there's like an interface solution. Like his idea is like, simplify interfaces, and you should have as few interfaces basically with this world as possible, and like you should find meaning from the analog world, is at least what I garnered from him. But this guy Josh Marin was talking about something, and he called it this, I love this, which is I said like, oh, like, don't you think I was talking about how augmented reality might be also another solution to the meaning crisis, because we're going to go from living our world down here to like once again living like with our world out here, and also freeing up our hands. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
like that, just that, the idea that like all of a sudden you use your hands. I mean, very few people like use their hands or know how to use their hands for a variety of different things. And he talks, and Josh talked about like digital animism, I think, or AR animism is what he described it, because like you could have a digital interface that allows you to go outside. You go into like a place like nature, and you could like really engage in nature with this like encyclopedic knowledge that you wouldn't have otherwise, and,
Right.
and fall in love with nature almost like through that all over again. So I posit those two things as counterbalances to this idea that like we go full virtual like all the time.
Right. I don't really see a problem with that personally. I think that's a brilliant idea. Kind of looking at this from a more science fiction standpoint, the idea that we can sort of augment reality to, I guess, interact with communities. Like, for example, say you're sitting in a room and you were able to project your hologram into somebody else's room, or sort of like some sort of Google Glass apparatus, where you're looking at somebody else who's in a totally different geographic location than you, standing right across from you, interacting with somebody. I think that the communal, the ability to use that kind of technology to sort of build and foster new communities, I think would probably be somewhat revolutionary. Obviously, the downside would be some sort of like Wall-E thing where people are sitting in chairs in a room all day,
Right.
and they're just projecting themselves sort of halfway across the world to somebody else who's just sitting in a chair all day. But yeah, no, I think that the idea of people going out in nature or going on a simple walk or something and having the ability to experience what they're looking at right in front of them from a totally new perspective or standpoint, or having something that kind of augments what they're experiencing then and there, is definitely a absolute net positive, at least to me. But the tech Sabbath concept, where you just kind of total tech fast over the weekend, me personally, I've kind of started to maybe not be as online, even though I'm still extremely online, of course, as most people in our generation are. But
yeah,
the idea that we can just step away for a while, I think a lot of people are starting to do that just in everyday life from a simple perspective. Also with people kind of moving back home during the coronavirus, that kind of thing, more people spending time with their family. I mean, I think that that's definitely a good idea from a personal perspective. I think everybody should probably try something like that at some point. But yeah, definitely augmenting real life has some amazing implications for sure.
Awesome. I find that we're agreeing, so I'm going to shift back to a different mode, since I like where we ended on that. So not back to, but I know you were very stoked, and right before I jumped on here, I was watching I was listening, but Matt Iglesias was, I know, just on Joe Rogan. I was just watching it. I saw your tweet. I was laughing because I was listening. Have you read 1 Billion Americans?
I haven't actually sat down to read the book yet beyond the introduction, but the concept itself, I think, is pretty brilliant, honestly. And to me, that kind of approach towards domestic policy could honestly be somewhat of a great uniter for different political factions in America. You've got people on the right who are pro-life, and you've got people on the left who are for, universal health care, other types of domestic economic policies that inject money or some sort of service into society or to individuals. I think that he's kind of uniting a lot of these factions in a really interesting, unique way that I think a lot of people have ignored or not really pushed for a while, especially immigration. I know he's a big proponent of increasing immigration, getting the smart people over here. I'm definitely a big time proponent of that. But yeah, no, I love the concept of 1 billion Americans. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, so just for everyone, I mean, as the title suggests very plainly, Matt Iglesias' suggestion is that we, over the course of the 21st century, uh, through immigration, also hopefully some level of renewal of the domestic birth rate, um, get ourselves to 1 billion Americans to counteract China. And which, for people who probably don't know, I mean, absent some kind of big breakthrough in longevity research, China is in also actually ironically as the ironic in the sense that it's the largest country right now in the world in a very difficult demographic position. Through the one child policy, their working age population by 2030
Right.
will decrease tremendously. But I'll just put it in a simple term: by 2100, their population will just about have halved. So if we have 1 billion Americans by the end of 2100, we will have something like 250 million more people than China. So
Right.
it's a very large vision, but actually also it's like if you compare it relative to other, like I don't really know the numbers of like if you compared like 1900 America, like the population relative to the amount like percentage of people that they then absorbed for the next like 100 years. It's very large. I mean, we might have tripled our population between 1900 and 2020, as far as I know. So
Right.
it's like not something. And by the way, for people who always, because a lot of the things that concerns people have is like, I don't want to live in like Hong Kong everywhere. Like I don't want like America to be a cityscape. But if we had 1 billion Americans, we would have the population density similar to like France, I believe. And
Right.
it's like
I think
I've
that's correct.
yeah, and France is a beautiful country with a lot of open space and so on. Okay, but I want to evolve this one step further, and suggest something to you. Be curious your thoughts. So, the Anglosphere, so the countries of the United States, basically the major countries that are offshoots of the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Um, so just a couple of statistics on that grouping of countries. 4 out of 4 of the world's food powers. So those countries that could exert geopolitical force through the export of food are part of the Anglosphere. They contain 40% of the world's wealth, 40% of the world's military expenditures, and they will likely be through renewable energy because of Australia and the United Kingdom, energy independent within several years as a bloc, because Canada and the United States are already energy independent.
Right.
Um, that's a tremendously powerful grouping of countries potentially. And what I find interesting about them is those 5 countries are absorbers of immigration, are the best in the world at absorbing immigrant populations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so even if there was a political pushback, so one, what do you think? I think that there should be some formalization of the relationship outside of like the Five Eyes and so on
Yeah,
between the
absolutely.
Anglo-Spheric countries. And on top of that, if there was ever a concern about right now, I think that that cohort of countries makes up like something approaching 500 million people. So if you spread it out between the land masses of Canada, the United States, and Australia alone, and New Zealand's actually not as small of a country as people think, it's a little bit more military, domestically digestible from a political standpoint, which from a pragmatic neoliberal perspective maybe would be appreciated. What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I basically think that we should enter into some sort of alliance with all those countries. Any greater union between the Anglosphere is definitely something that we should look towards moving forward from a foreign policy perspective. In terms of immigration, obviously, I'm very pro immigration. I think that I guess from an economic perspective, the movement of capital across borders obviously is a huge net positive, especially coming from countries where a lot of people are leaving and coming to America for academic resources, et cetera,
Yeah.
and just for a better life in general. That, along with increased birth rates, et cetera,
Right.
could lead to some serious net positives. Kind of looking at you made a comment about how if we did have 1 billion Americans, we'd have the density of a country like France. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we'd have cities literally everywhere, the urban
Yeah.
hellscape, that kind of thing. Uh, I love urban areas. I love being in the city every now and then. I kind of live on the suburb of Nashville. Nashville isn't a huge city or anything, but
Mhm.
the if you couple that with uh, YIMBY policies,
Mhm. Yes, in
and
my
kind
backyard
of
for those
yeah,
who don't know.
and kind of push for the ability for people to create, denser housing, uh, better suburbs. Um, you know, I very well think America could handle that kind of increase in population over the next 100 years. And I think that from a practical standpoint, I think it's a good goal, especially in the Anglosphere. And any sort of union between the countries in the Anglosphere is definitely a good thing.
Awesome. Um, okay. Yeah, because I was talking, one of my big things was like they should coordinate their immigration policy. I mean, I see
Right.
very little reason why they, um, uh, and I know that Kazakh, those countries, it's interesting because a lot of people think an Anglo Union that contained the United States wouldn't be a good thing because the United States would just so overpower the other four countries that really what should be is like the Kazakh countries, so Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand should
Right.
form political union and basically like on those terms like form a union with the United States to counterbalance like basically what is a very overweight relationship. Okay, one area which is obviously of a lot of importance to many people and could be of existential an existential risk. I'm more convinced than not, but I'm less convinced than I ever have been that climate change poses an existential risk to a country like the United States, let alone like I'm not like no, I wouldn't make that argument for a country like Morocco, for example.
Right.
Um, and I spent some time in Israel. It's hot enough. And so, where do you see pragmatism and neoliberalism making an impact on that issue? And the reason I ask, right, is because a lot of the responses to climate change, certainly, in my view, and I think most people's view, and I do believe it is most people, wouldn't fall in the under the guise of pragmatism. And
Right.
many of those people that hold the policy views that aren't pragmatic wouldn't consider themselves neoliberal, even if they might be in many other
Right.
areas.
Right.
What do you think about that? Yeah.
From just kind of looking at the landscape, I'm very anti Green New Deal as it's been proposed by the left wing of the liberals in America. The AOC, Bernie wing, that kind of thing. It's not feasible. It's not really, honestly, I don't see it as geared towards actually doing something rather than totally transforming our economy towards whatever their vision is or what it could be. But I am uh, very positive. I have positive feelings towards the pragmatic view that something like a carbon tax or cap and
Mm-hmm.
trade or carbon dividends is a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's generally the pragmatic view, is you have a lot of conservatives in the United States who have proposed some form or another of that. Uh, we had former Florida Representative Carlos Curbelo was a big time proponent of some sort of carbon tax, carbon cap and trade dividend plan, and some other conservatives. You have organizations like, um, gosh, I can't think of it now, ACC in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, which kind of approach climate policy from a conservative standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they kind of look at it from more of a pro-business perspective. They don't endorse a carbon tax, but they do endorse kind of common sense solutions. As for exactly what those are, um, I can't give you like a bulleted list or anything, but
Sure, sure, sure.
it's more of looking at it from like, oh, well, what's something that everybody can agree on? Well, one of their big things was the Trillion Trees Act, which Donald Trump
Yep.
actually did sign. Um,
You could thank
which,
Ivanka for that.
yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of, to me, it doesn't go far enough, but it is a positive move towards actually doing something. And anything that's a
Absolutely.
positive move towards doing something, to me, when it comes to climate policy, is a good thing. And you have groups like Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends. They work with bigger groups. They actually were the ones, not necessarily that group, but kind of like, I guess, their wings sort of union of groups are responsible for a large open letter sort of that was signed by several economists. Well, it was more than several. It was like tens, hundreds or something like that. But several large Nobel laureates signed it. And that was kind of, to me, a sign that, hey, you know, this is a policy that we should probably be looking for in America, because it seems like a lot of people across the aisle on both sides generally support that kind of policy. So for me, some sort of carbon tax or cap and trade or dividend or something is probably the climate change solution moving forward.
Will, I want to ask, because you brought something up, and I think it's super interesting and important. And I think you're the right person to talk to about it, given where you stand. I find, so there is a group that I may be talking to, which is the Gen Z GOP, which is basically this organization that's trying to basically put out a platform, you know, how people in Gen Z view, you know, conservative politics in the United States. I see a tremendous amount of capitulation from the right on issues that I think they've correctly ascertained are losing issues. Like climate change is a losing issue, gay marriage, gay rights, various things, losing issue. And the left also constantly harkens, you know, and kind of harps on these issues, you know, and identitarian politics and all these things to kind of gain elections. Two things. One, that capitulation seems like an enormous opportunity to actually get like substantial things done.
Right.
And two, so like, it almost seems to me like the burden of proof is on the left, to be honest with you. And that the failures of the potential failure to actually have action, for example, in the next 4 years with the Biden administration, would really genuinely, on some of these issues, particularly on climate, outside of the Green New Deal, I would actually like rest solely on the shoulders of the Democratic Party if that does come to pass. What do you think it says? Are you more hopeful? Are you hopeful that the Democrats will recognize that capitulation and seize that opportunity? Is there something maybe also from the right that they could do to kind of sweeten the deal and get it going? But in general, on a whole suite of issues, I find that the right has capitulated a lot and is prepared to do more, because as they look at the demographics of their party, which I think they did very well on, you know, this election cycle, even though they lost the presidency, they killed it down ballot. So what do you think?
I think that brings up a couple really interesting points. One of which is the generational divide on some of those issues. You know, I've looked at the Pew statistics on all of this, all their polls they've done on this that separate the views on these specific subjects by generation. And it's very clear to me that the younger generations are a lot more liberal than older generations, even within the conservative side of politics in America. And because these are issues that Republicans have ignored for so long, or kind of sat around in social stasis on, in terms of where they are on the issues, they are seeing unprecedented movement from younger generations permanently towards the left because they're unwilling to move on these. But the problem is within the Democratic Party, you have two different wings kind of fighting for power, and one of them, the left wing, basically has just totally lost because they're unwilling to look for pragmatic solutions to these problems. And while I think that a lot of their social stances are very popular in general in America, you know, there's still a lot of people that aren't willing to kind of give into that vision of what they see America as. And while I think that some radical solutions are necessary in certain areas, they're never going to get anything done because they're totally unwilling to work with anybody. So I think we're kind of somewhat seeing a little bit of an alignment. And because the Democrats, the establishment Democrats, are kind of letting the left sort of, I guess, run their mouth, sort of, in a way, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term. They're totally kind of missing an opportunity to really pick up, get this serious mandate. And I think that a lot of these voters that still side with conservatives because of that are, they're totally missing out on these. And yeah, I mean, in general, I just, somewhat of a realignment is happening, and it is very interesting. And that's kind of the way I see it, is you've got four different sets, sort of, I guess, playing political chess right now.
It's funny. It's because, like, looking at the results of the election, obviously with Georgia still up in the air, I guess, to reveal myself a little bit, I certainly hope that at least one of those races is won by a Republican to, create the divided Congress, because
Same.
I really think that election was, like, as close to threading a needle as you possibly could. Right.
Right.
You kind of got Trump. Whether Trumpism really goes away, I mean, you talk about Hawley and other people. There are people that will carry that banner,
right?
And maybe they should. Maybe those voices. I mean, those grievances and that point of view, deserves to have a place and an outlet in our policy, in our politics. But that one, like, I think it was very clear. Like, Trumpism, for example, was not really rejected all that much per se. But wokeism, for example, like, there could not have been a bigger rejection in my view. And I really do get the sense, and I could certainly see it on Twitter, that which I feel embarrassed to use, but, like, as a proxy, but because it is it is just a proxy, and it's a sample group, but, like, that the social justice warriors and wokeism has very much dissipated. I don't know if you've seen the same thing. I am worried that the corporate part of this of American society will use wokeism for various purposes that obviously are for their own gain.
Right.
Like NASDAQ, for example, just created a rule that you'll be delisted without having a female and a minority, somebody of a minority group on your board. Now, of course, I'm not like, I have no problem. Like, that sounds fantastic. We should have diverse boards. There's enormous amounts of psychological research that tells you that diverse groups of people make better decisions. Just to say that mandating it, delisting. I mean, they made that announcement at the same time that the U.S. Congress passed a law, that would allow us to delist Chinese companies for not passing accounting screens, or, like, adhering to our accounting standards. It's very interesting that a private company would basically result in the same exact thing, which is delisting on the exchanges, but for some kind of moral proclamation or something like that. I mean, it just gets. But I do think overall, like, that was rejected. Two things. I'll simplify. One, do you see that as well? I mean, in terms of the results of the election, do you read it the same way that I do? And two, do you have any concerns about the weaponization of wokeism, even though it's been rejected at the ballot box by corporate entities for various gains?
So the way I like to think about this is, I agree with the Milton Friedman view that basically the only thing a company has to do is, make money and give money to shareholders. That's their social responsibility. I think society in general is moving towards, being more diverse and welcoming of anything that isn't the traditional view of what should be in X or Y place, and I don't really think we need sort of wokeism to direct society towards that. But wokeism itself, I'm absolutely vehemently opposed to it, because it's mostly a liberal. I don't really see sort of, the whole canceling thing. Normal people don't even know what that is, probably. I mean, that's super online, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, that kind of thing. Normal people, they're just not that woke. But in general, I think that the statistics do show and the polls show that people are a lot more welcoming of anything that isn't what they see as normal these days. But I don't think that we need, you know, elites or whatever in society kind of from Harvard or Yale telling us, well, Latin people or Latino people in America need to be called Latinx or Latinx or however you say it.
Right.
I don't even know how you say it.
It's Latinx.
Yeah, there you go.
Sounds like Kleenex.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you know, the greatest statistic on that was that they polled Latino Americans and said, like, what percentage of you are familiar with this term? 80%, I believe, had never heard of it.
Right.
And then only 3% of it would use it. Now, that may actually align with the actual statistics in the Latino community that are like non-binary or whatever. It's fine. And like, that's totally cool. Like, I think by what you're kind of alluding to, if somebody in a work setting or a personal setting asked you to use that term,
right,
like, you would respect that decision.
Yeah, totally.
It is the mandate, the top down mandate of it that I think people are rejecting. And I'd ask you, Will, do you think, because you say normal people, but you're also kind of almost alluding to a demographic divide or a generational divide, do you think that wokeism is the majoritarian view in millennials and Gen Z?
In millennials and Gen Z, I think the older view of, like, you know, social justice and stuff is probably the majoritarian view,
right?
But not necessarily like this hyper woke view or anything like that. You know, because we
like the Stonewall view, like the Stonewall view of social justice,
right? Like, you know, we grew up, or I guess people our age, you know, we grew up on Xbox chat rooms where everybody was yelling like slurs at each other and saying, "Oh, I'm gonna kill your mom" or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't really see. I think that it's definitely an improvement, a social improvement, that people have become a lot more respectful of the out group.
Sure,
but I don't necessarily see like the woke side of things, not necessarily like the social justice side of things. To me, I kind of see those as two different things a little bit.
Absolutely.
Where social justice seeks like mutual respect of identity and stuff like that. And the ability to become what it is that you do become, and the respect of that, or the result of that. Wokeism is like that on steroids. Like, it's totally different in a way, but it's also somewhat, to me, wokeism requires the mandate. And that's kind of sort of, I don't really see that as the majority view, but I see that as becoming a lot more popular, especially with stuff like cancel culture becoming a thing. You know, like I wrote an article about that on my Substack where I, you know, kind of went through several examples of just this year of people trying to cancel somebody over something that was totally unwarranted. And, you know, that kind of thing it's not conductive to any sort of discourse in society. And I think moving forward, even people who are adherents to that kind of approach towards society are probably becoming a little bit bearish on that issue these days. And
so
I honestly hope.
Okay, go ahead.
I honestly hope that more and more people kind of sort of reject that and move back towards the more, I guess, decade-old understanding of what social justice is.
Yeah, and what I find interesting, so two things. What I'm hearing from you is like, one, like, I feel like election 2020 was peak wokeism. Like, literally, we could actually, because of the very nature of just that historical event, that we could literally point to a date. And two, like, but also it's important, right? Because it's also hard to speak about these things. You know, it's important to reaffirm. Like, I remember, I mean, if you just think about from 2008 to 2016 under the Obama administration's years, they were a great steward of an enormous amount of social progression in the area, certainly of LGBTQ stuff and other things. And like, I do think the majority of people view that as an incredibly good thing.
Right. Absolutely.
And it's important, I think, to just, because one of the things that I think that wokeism also is a reaction to Trumpism and the worry that all of the
Right.
freedoms and all the progress that was made under the Obama years was about to be taken away. Like, I almost wonder how correlated you could do this. Like, it's like we won't be able to run this experiment, but like, had, for example, the transgender ban in the military not occurred, I wonder like what the difference would be, because that was a real shot across the bow, right? It
Right.
harkens back to I'm forgetting the Clinton era, like don't ask, don't tell, do not ask, don't ask, don't tell,
Right.
and that like that whole idea of like forcing people basically back into the closet in many ways. Because I very much think of it as a reactionary result.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of an underrated view of it. And I think people like James Lindsay, who
Yeah,
before the election announced that because of the rise of wokeism, he was going to vote for Trump. I think that is, you know, vote for Trump if you feel like it. That's your prerogative. But at the same time, I think he was not looking at it quite correctly because, like you said, you kind of see it as sort of a reaction to Trumpism. I
yeah,
agree with that in the sense that it's so extreme because it's against Trump. And I don't really see it having much sway in society now that Joe Biden is the president elect.
mm-hmm.
Kind of how it was under Obama. I don't really see that becoming uh, a feverish extreme
Yeah.
now that Trump's out of power.
And I mean, we'll talk about it one more time, I guess, but because it's amazing how prescient he is. But like Bruno, he called Biden the kill switch,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? That like Joe Biden was the kill switch, both so for Trumpism, but also for wokeism. Now, I'm actually firmly of the belief, really, that some form of Trumpism, and maybe it'd be too much of, we'd probably do well for ourselves to find a different name,
Right.
but just because of the way he would utilize that. And wokeism, that like he's a kill switch for that. Because, and what I find also interesting is like he's a kill switch for that. And I think that social justice, as defined by maybe what occurred under the Obama administration, that really aligns nicely to virtualism, and this
Right.
idea of, because it really allows, it marries nicely for that with that, I think.
Yeah, I think that that's part of the virtue of Bruno's view is that he kind of paints everything as sort of a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, Biden is a kill switch because he doesn't really stand for much
Mm-hmm.
at the core. And I think that is true moving forward. But while he's a kill switch, there's also, like I mentioned, how there's kind of four political factions in the United States now.
Yeah.
To me, each I guess faction sort of has its own narrative, and uh, that's kind of how that fits in with the Bruno understanding of
Walk through those. Walk
virtualism.
through those four factions, if you will.
So you've got the left wing of the Democrats. They kind of have painted this. I think AOC is actually the perfect example, along with Bernie, of kind of creating a narrative of America up to this point has been a failure in many ways. Let's, you know, I, when it comes to Bernie specifically, I don't believe that he loves America or loves the American experiment. I've never been convinced of that. I'm pretty bearish on that. And to me, it seems like he wants to do away with America and create basically a European nation that's a social
Mm-hmm.
democracy that, spends money like it's candy, etc. And that's kind of the narrative that they've painted, that America needs to be self-sufficient. And in a way, that's kind of mirrored exactly on the most right faction, where America has been spending money too much, and instead we need to focus on ourselves. But, you know, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of the kind of proposals are basically the same, like,
Mm-hmm.
withdrawing our troops from other countries,
The
even though one
justifications are
says,
just different.
right. And even though one says we need to spend more money and one says we need to spend less money, it's a populist understanding of where the government fits in the American life. And closer to the center, you have, you know, never Trump conservatives who, now that the populist right has kind of come into power, or I guess is kind of waning at this point,
Mm-hmm.
their narrative is the old America, Reagan, Romney, McCain, that kind of thing, kind of tucked tail, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the left liberal view of America, where you've got the people that read Vox all the time, went to Harvard, went to Yale, that kind of thing, which there isn't a problem with any of that necessarily. But to me, a lot of it kind of hinges on an old view of America and sort of how they react to how America has been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely spot on with that view of America. I think that's the four cohorts. One thing that I find very interesting, right? One, I mean, you're right. The idea that at the fringes, excuse me, they are just populist understanding. So you're basically
Right.
going to have a similar policy set, at least on certain things like foreign policy and maybe economic policy, not social. Like the one thing that they disagree with is social policy. And that's actually just
Right,
basically the
exactly.
dividing line. But on foreign policy and economic policy, they basically arrive at the same point from a different place. And then you have the center left and center right. My problem with the center left and the center right as it actually exists, what I once again love about your definition of neoliberalism is I almost expected you to kind of fall purely in cahoots with that. But I think you would maybe agree with me in the fact that both of those, like the center right, has not totally absorbed and then changed its rhetoric to match the capitulation, for example, on issues like climate change and so on. Right? Like they haven't gotten themselves to say it. Mitch McConnell has not gotten himself to say, oh well, X, Y, Z on climate change. There are certain people who I find interesting who have. And then on the left, the center left, my big problem is that I feel like they think Trump was an anomaly, like they didn't learn anything, and they're like, we're always going to win. And
they're looking at him as a problem and not a symptom of the actual problem. The direction that American politics have been heading for so long has, kind of been headed in a bad direction. And Trump basically took advantage of that. And he's not an anomaly, he's a symptom. And that's kind of like, I totally agree.
So, excuse me. Okay. So two things. One, what is he a symptom of? So like, what is maybe, if you could give an analysis of what you think maybe one of the core, like what's the core of the issue? And then two, turning this, in kind of the closing set of questions, let's push towards certain solutions. Do you see somebody who could carry the banner of a solutions-oriented politics that's inclusive? Do you, or what does that potentially look like? Yeah.
Trump to me as a symptom and not the actual problem itself. Obviously he's ridiculously populist. He brings that populist understanding, or what understanding he does have of American politics, geopolitics, economic policy, etc., to the White House. That's what he did in 4 years.
Right.
And, he had I think it's kind of dishonest not to admit that he had a few wins here and there.
Oh, absolutely. I think geopolitically, other than the core thing of alienating like our core allies, other than maybe Japan, because he also alienated Korea. I thought you could argue that he had great foreign policy.
Yeah, honestly, I think that
by the way, I'm going to get murdered for that, Will. I live in New York City. I have a lot of friends who will watch this, but go ahead.
Yeah, before the pandemic, I probably would have said that his foreign policy wasn't hawkish enough. And to an extent, I don't think it was hawkish enough. But at the same time, it's not that his foreign policy was bad or that it was good. To me, it's that his foreign policy was honest. And I think that a lot of the moves he did were better than something that Obama would have done. or were a more honest representation rhetorically of what he was actually doing. You know, he had obvious successes like assassinating Soleimani.
Yeah.
I think honestly, there's no way you could say that was a bad thing. It was an absolutely reckless move, but it was a very good one, you know, and that definitely obviously weakened Iran to a large extent. You know, they
And the
reacted
Middle
by
East
shooting down
normalization. I mean, the normalization with Israel and the Middle East is. I've spent quite a bit of time in Israel.
Right.
Open Kimono, I work for the Israeli government, but I think that like you said, honest, like in terms of like talking about his foreign policy.
Right.
Any honest view of the Middle East adheres to his view of the Middle East as
Right.
a divide between Sunni and Shia, where the idea of not imposing, you know, liberal values on Sunni Shia, Sunni Muslim countries, you know, just let them align against their common, you know, shared threat, and don't kind of ask more of them, you know, in that regard.
Right. And, you know, we've had historic peace deals being signed in recent months between a lot of these countries. And that's obviously a very good thing with the normalization of relations between Israel, the UAE, and other countries. You know, to me, Trump was a very honest figure. And I don't feel like Obama was very honest in the sense that he liked to dress up a lot of his policy or populist leanings in academic, trying to think how to put this, you know, I like to complain a lot about liberal condescension. And I think that that's honestly a big
Yeah.
problem because a lot of times liberals in America, they don't want to humanize the other side, or they think they're stupid or anti-intellectual, which to an extent some of them can be anti-intellectual.
Sure.
But it's with good reason in the sense that, you know, they've kind of left them behind as part of the technocratic conversation. And to me, Obama kind of represented that. And there's no other person that has probably impacted my view of the Obama administration better than Martin Gurry's book, Revolt of the Public, where he kind of talks about, he kind of breaks down, you know, the popular view of the Obama administration and pokes holes in how normal people see it or how we see it as liberals or liberal adjacent. And you know, to me, Trump kind of took what Obama did, ran with it from a totally different perspective, and just kind of smashed the system, sort of tested. He stressed it. And right now, I think we're seeing that the system is pretty, I guess, anti-fragile, for lack of a better term.
To use Nassim Taleb, it is.
And I've been very
proud. It's almost like something to be proud of.
Yeah, right. I don't have it by me, but the most recent Economist cover that I pulled out of the mailbox this morning was something along the lines of the seeds of sort of democracy are sown within our liberal democracies, in the sense that our way out is part of the system, where the system has prevented any sort of, you know, anything worse than what we're seeing right now, which is like a 46-minute rant on social media, on video. And that's, you know, he hasn't really gotten to do anything other than complain about how he lost and stuff like that. And, you know, while we're seeing politicians who are, I guess, trying to side with him, they're not really getting anywhere because the system won't allow them to get anywhere.
I don't think that they're, you know, and I honestly think it's a little bit more calculated than that. They're just trying to pick up his electorate. You know, Ted Cruz is like, cool, I'll take that. Like, that's smart. I get it. It's realpolitik. I totally get it. And I do think, so you touched on it, so I want to extract it, because I think the biggest problem in American politics is liberal condescension.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Period. Like, because it prevents, because people actually on the, you know, the level of dehumanization on the left is pretty disgusting. And I can certainly speak from it from like a New York cosmopolitan, like, you know, sitting in conversations very quietly. Um, if you just take a look at Ron Howard's recent release on Netflix, I think it was Netflix, of Hillbilly Elegy,
Right.
and the literary, or the critical reaction to that, it's just dripping in liberal condescension. I don't think any of those people actually watched the movie, and I don't mean that they didn't actually watch the movie. I mean that
Right.
like they weren't the irony of their lack of an open mind towards the suffering of people that you greatly disagree with or are
Right.
different than is something very, very, very troubling. It is probably the kernel of the issue of a lot of the dehumanization. It's the reason why also, so it's like it's the reason why why people are okay with being viewed as consumers as opposed to citizens. It's the reason why
Right.
for all of these things, it is just a core dehumanization of the other that exists in American politics.
Yeah, I mean, Hillbilly Elegy specifically, I think that there are some good criticisms to be had of the actual book itself and
Mm-hmm.
probably of the movie, of course. But no, I totally agree. I think that people just kind of looking at that vision of how it was in America or how it is in America, there was one thread I saw on Twitter where somebody who grew up on food stamps was kind of talking about their experience of it. And they were kind of comparing and contrasting Vance's version of his upbringing. And they were talking about how, they counted individual coins. I have family that, grew up dirt poor here in Tennessee. I still have people who are probably part of that demographic here in Tennessee in my family. And, a lot of it honestly spoke to a lot of people in my family, his vision of America and kind of how it is. And I think that there's definitely a lot of truth to what JD Vance has to say. But the problem is like you said, a lot of people, like at Vox Media writing bad reviews of it or something. I'm just using
Yeah.
Vox as an example, but
No,
that
it's
kind
definitely the
of
whipping post.
yeah, that kind of view of any sort of alternative narrative of America is totally unacceptable. I don't understand why people seem to think that that's the hill to die on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's like it's a paternalistic point of view that they have, and I think it's something akin to like raising your son, okay? And it's like they're not as fast as you were at that age, or it's almost like right because it's almost like they're upset that these people were left behind. Like
Right.
the reaction is not like how can I help get you to where I am. It's like there's something wrong with you. Why can't you keep up?
It's almost like they're mad that somebody is pointing out that there are failures or something wrong with the system that they
Right.
built or that they have advocated for decades, since the modern welfare state was created by Roosevelt. And it's kind of silly that they would expect people to praise the system that was built this way.
Which they critique themselves.
Right.
All right, you've been very generous with your time. Well, I'll ask you one final question. So
Sure.
I started Grab the Reins because I felt that there was an enormous amount of learned helplessness that existed in the millennial and Gen Z generation. And I wanted to prop up people that I felt had a vision or had ideas about grabbing the reins, whether it was within their own life, within their community, or just in the world of ideas. Um, what would you suggest to people in terms of being able for them to be able to grab the reins of any element of society? Is there anything that you want to convey to people that would be a message of that there is something that they can do, that there's something vital to their lives that they can do and to society, and that they can participate in wherever this neoliberal project or American project moves forward?
Right. For me, the absolute core things moving forward for people to do to kind of, like you say, grab the reins is, obviously, I think that more people getting involved in politics that want to make an effort to strive for solutions that work for everyone or the majority of people. That, working with people is the clearest path forward. And I think that any sort of pragmatism is a net positive for communities, for political organizations, etc. Um, I talked about in my Substack about the term limits and stuff like that. I kind of point out that if you really want to make something happen, then the absolute best way to do it is get organized as a community, have the difficult conversations, have the conversation with each other, and choose to do something or choose to jump in and, sort of take the reins for yourself, sort of have some agency politically, etc., both in your community and in the political system.
Will, thank you so much for your time, man. I hope to have you back. Everyone else, my name is Eric Wahlberg, and thank you so much for grabbing the reins.
Absolutely.